In 1996, the metal scene was in a really weird spot. The early 90s had seen the genre's mainstream grip slip as grunge and alternative rock took over. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden weren't just topping the charts. They were actually a nice change of pace for many who were just getting really tired of the entire glam hair metal thing that had been happening prior. People were digging this unpolished, introspective nature of grunge. It really struck a nerve. And it was like the larger-than-life theatrics of the 80s metal all of a sudden felt out of touch. But by 1996, even grunge itself was evolving. The scene had fractured, morphed, giving rise to this new wave of alternative metal bands like Korn, Marilyn Manson, and Tool. Korn brought this unsettling mix of detuned guitars mixed in with hip-hop and these wild lyrics that connected with disenchanted youth. Marilyn Manson leaned into shock rock, blending industrial metal with provocative, often unsettling performances. Tool, on the other hand, was progressive, artistic. The music challenged the listener with all these complex time signatures and metaphysical themes. And all this stuff played out really well on MTV, which still had a huge influence over what music was actually finding a wide audience. And even the titans of metal weren't immune to the changing tides. Metallica, who had been the flag bearers of thrash metal all through the 80s, took this huge sharp turn into alternative rock territory with Load. No more bullet belts and denim vests. They had the short haircuts and the guy liner and much more artsy-fartsy album covers. And the music reflected the shift as well. More bluesy, polished. To many fans, a hell of a lot more commercial. To some of the old guard, this was like a betrayal. As if the band who once wrote Master of Puppets traded their gritty authenticity for mainstream appeal. But for metal purists, it seemed like the genre's pulse was fading. 80s metal bands that hadn't adapted were either defunct or struggling to stay relevant. Newer groups that did find success often did so by blending metal with other genres, new metal with hip-hop, industrial metal with electronic stuff. It was all there to make it just much more palatable to the average rock radio listener. But while much of the scene bent to the winds of change, Pantera stood as a middle finger to the mainstream. They were not going to play nice, and the Great Southern Trendkill would prove it. Rather than adapt, they doubled down, harsher, heavier, more hostile than ever. At a time when metal seemed to be trying to negotiate its place in the mainstream, Pantera reminded everybody what it sounded like when the band just didn't give a damn. And by the time Pantera started working on the Great Southern Trendkill, the band was teetering on the edge of collapse. The relationship between vocalist Phil Anselmo and the Abbott brothers, Dime and Vinnie, had totally soured, and the camaraderie that had once defined the band unraveled into distrust and resentment. And much of this discord could be traced back to Phil's chronic back pain, which by this time was just a constant gnawing presence in his life. He didn't want to go through surgery and endure a long recovery, so instead he turned to heroin and painkillers as a temporary escape, but it turned out to be a really huge crutch. And as Phil sank deeper into addiction, his behavior was a lot more erratic. He distanced himself from his bandmates, choosing isolation over brotherhood. And when he did interact, it was often through lashing out. Their friendship of the early years had pretty much curdled into this cold, uneasy truce. The band, already battered by the punishing tour schedule for Far Beyond Driven, found themselves dealing not just with exhaustion, but this emotional drain of managing Phil's volatility. Rex Brown, the bass player, described it as a time when the discipline and structure that once defined the group had pretty much evaporated. They were pretty much running on autopilot, surviving on fumes and sheer stubbornness. But despite the chaos, the record label wanted another album. The mid-90s music scene had shifted sharply away from traditional metal, and Pantera's success was this outlier, one that the label wanted to exploit before the wave broke. But where most bands might have softened their sound to fit the climate, Pantera had the exact opposite reaction. Instead of playing nice, they set out to make a record that felt like a sheer punch to the face. They wanted to take all that exhaustion, anger, frustration, channel it into this record that told the music industry exactly where to shove its expectations. And that dark energy reached a fever pitch on July 13th, 1996, when Phil Anselmo overdosed on heroin backstage in Dallas. He was technically dead for several minutes, only to be revived by paramedics. And 4 days later, he put out a press release that read, "I will not die so easily." It was defiant, sure, but also a stark reminder of just how close Pantera had come to losing their frontman, and how the band itself was actually hanging by a thread. And the OD didn't just mark a low point for Phil, it cast this whole shadow over the entire album. The Great Southern Trendkill became this vessel for all that pain and tension, a document of a band falling apart and somehow finding strength in the chaos. There's nothing polished or sanitized about it. This was the group at their most unfiltered, clawing, screaming, and refusing to go down quietly. And the recording process for the Great Southern Trendkill was as fractured as the band itself. Phil, drowning in his own demons, recorded his vocals at Trent Reznor's Nothing Studios in New Orleans. Meanwhile, Dimebag Darrell, Vinnie Paul, and Rex Brown set up camp in Dallas at Dimebag's makeshift home studio called Chasin' Jason. It was the first time the band had recorded separately, and Phil's choice to isolate himself wasn't just about geography. It was about hiding his drug use, keeping that addiction veiled from his bandmates. Chasin' Jason was more of a backyard barn experiment than a professional recording studio. It started as a jam room and morphed into this makeshift studio cobbled together with 3 Tascam DA-88s, a little Mackie board, and eventually the MCI 500 console that the band had used on previous records. But the rustic setup came with this heap of problems. The room had all sorts of technical issues, phase control problems, persistent buzzing, and a general lack of the polished infrastructure a major metal band would expect. There was a reason they called it Chasin' Jason. According to Rex Brown, there'd always be something fucking wrong. It was a constant battle to keep the equipment from getting in the way of the music. And if the studio wasn't enough of a problem, Phil's absence added this whole other layer of unpredictability. The band was laying down tracks without knowing what Phil would bring to the table vocally. Normally, Dime preferred to record his guitar leads after the vocals were set, letting Phil's direction guide his creative choices. But this time he had to fly blind, trusting his gut and hoping whatever he came up with would fit. The usual process of bouncing ideas off each other, refining parts, and locking in as a unit was gone. Instead, it was a chaotic, almost improvisational experience. With Dime's riff tape worn out and the band burned out, much of the album came together through sheer spontaneity. And for Anselmo, Nothing Studios became this dark sanctuary. His vocals on the Great Southern Trendkill are among his most unvarnished and purely tortured. You could hear the heroin in his voice, anguish, detachment, all his anger turned inward. Phil described his state of mind as sleepwalking, functioning through this fog of opioids and pain. And for the rest of the group, the process was grueling. They were frustrated by the lack of structure and the inability to collaborate fully, and the creeping realization that Phil's self-imposed exile was more than just a need for space. It was a sign of how deep his struggles were going. And the music they made during this period wasn't just heavy in sound, but heavy with the weight of a band coming apart at the seams. And somehow, through all this confusion and chaos, they captured that tension on tape, bottling lightning in a way that felt unfiltered and undeniably real. And when it came to crafting the sound on the Great Southern Trendkill, Pantera relied on this mix of unrefined ingenuity and tried-and-true gear. It was a hodgepodge of fully professional gear and a whole lot of DIY setup. I mean, it definitely wasn't exactly Abbey Road on the side of the band. Dime's guitar arsenal was anchored by those iconic Deans, including his famous Dean from Hell. The guitar's unmistakable look, sky blue with the lightning bolt graphics, was only outdone by its aggressive, unmistakable tone. And he paired those Deans with Randall's solid-state amplifiers, giving that razor-sharp edge that had definitely become a huge hallmark to the Pantera sound. There was a certain brutality and also immediacy that he would get out of those amps, and that contributed a lot to his sound. And around this time, too, he was using that Digitech whammy pedal, and this way he could do some serious dive-bombing of notes without actually using a whammy bar, in ways that a guitar itself physically just could not pull off. And that would create some eerie pitch-shifting effects that really worked so well on this album. And Vinnie Paul's drums brought that usual blend of power and precision. He used his Tama kit and Sabian cymbals that cut through that wall of guitars just right. And that was the thing about Vinnie. He wasn't just about timekeeping. It was about creating a foundation that could really hold up the weight of Pantera's sonic assault. His kick drums are like sledgehammers, and he had a real sharpness with the snare that just added to that mix in a way that always kept everything together and let the band just get as heavy as they wanted to without any running away. And Rex Brown used the Ampeg SVT bass heads and cabinets, which had that perfect thick, gritty tone that filled at the low end, with a concrete-like density but never got in the way or muddied anything up. He used the good old Fender Precision bass, which had always been a staple in rock and metal. It's just such a balanced sounding instrument. Bass players are often the unsung heroes in bands, and Rex is really not an exception. But when you listen to this album really tight, it's almost as if he's transparent, and yet he actually plays a really huge part in keeping those grooves so tight and locked in. But for all the trouble that they had in terms of technical issues, buzz, and phase problems, the lack of polish really fed into the album's abrasive character. Pantera's gear wasn't just a means to an end, it was an extension of their state of mind. So the album kicks off with the Great Southern Trendkill, and it's fully a sledgehammer to the face, a beautiful smack to the listener's frontal lobe. The Great Southern Trendkill is fast, insane, with Phil letting out some of the most guttural scream you can imagine right at the top of it. His voice is pure primal rage, while the band pulls out all the stops. This is Pantera saying, "Here we are, motherfuckers. You thought the last one was heavy? That was Barry Manilow compared to what we're about to throw down here." The track also features guest vocals from Seth Putnam of Anal Cunt, whose screaming additions pile on an extra layer of abrasion. The lyrics are a manifesto of disdain, taking shots at the media, and anybody Phil Anselmo saw as false or hollow. Musically, it's pure balls to the wall, with Dime and the group alternating between all-out thrash and this particular blend of groove metal that only Pantera can kick out properly. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it slows down for the solo part into this ungodly riff full of sheer attitude that's guaranteed to make everybody's head move in this pure, painful, headbanging motion. Dime gets in there with all his wild pinch harmonics, having somewhat of a guitar battle with himself, both sides winning. Total headphone candy, which makes this song completely stand out. And if the opener was a punch, War Nerve is like a steel-toed kick to the teeth. The track wastes no time with pleasantries, diving right into Phil's unfiltered rage. His opening line, truly "fuck the world," sets the tone for what is one of the band's most confrontational tracks. Here he rails against media scrutiny, pressures of fame, and of course he does not hold back. And the band backs him perfectly with this soundscape that has that hostile, almost claustrophobic vibe. Gnashing guitars and drums hitting like explosions. And that's the thing that makes Pantera so damn heavy, is their groove. Yes, bands can thrash, they can do all sorts of speed metal stuff or whatever, but because of the fact that Pantera locks into this groove, unless a band can groove at that level, it's damn near impossible to get anywhere near the level of heaviness that these guys were capable of. Add to that the sheer attitude of Dime and his interplay with his brother Vinnie, and you have the world's most potent combination right there. Drag the waters. As the album slips into this comfortable pace, if it wasn't on before, it sure as hell is on now. This is where the definition of groove metal kicks in fully, and it features some of the coolest rhythm changes in the band's catalog. And it also shows how strong Vinnie and Rex Brown are locked in, with Dime just pouring it over the top, making everything sound freaking outrageous. Drag the Water stands out not just for its grinding groove, but also its visual representation. Dimebag took the reins as director for the song's black and white music video, which captured the vibe of the track's gritty tone. And the lyrics for this one covered deception, the difficulty of discerning truth from lies, but it's got that swampy and sleazy, hard-hitting music with Dime's guitar work just oozing through the speakers. It has a hypnotic rhythm, luring the listener into this murky world of distrust and suspicion. It also features one of Dime's most creative solos where he completely changes the tone. And if anybody heard the earlier mixes of the album, it's pretty obvious that they left his tone exactly the same for this particular solo for the lead part. And then slowing things down, Tens is this sludgy, creeping exploration of addiction's dark underbelly. The track feels like it's wading through quicksand. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Phil's lyrics are introspective, a stark look at the agony of dependency and the slow erosion of hope. And the music mirrors this with droning riffs and a tempo that drags deliberately, forcing that listener to sit with the band's discomfort. The solo for this one is taste upon taste, kind of reminiscent of some of Dime's work over Cemetery Gates, but it's obvious that by this time, Dimebag has done so much musical exploration, and it really shows in the melodies here. Absolutely beautiful through and through in such a painful way. And if Tens was a slow burn, 13 Steps to Nowhere is an explosion. That riff makes anybody ask what the hell is happening right now. Starting off with this diminished progression, and then it goes into this complex pentatonic with some nice chromatics thrown in. And this also features some more of Seth Putnam's chaotic vocals, and the track really mirrors Phil's fractured mental state at the time. It's like an unstable structure to the song's feel, as if it could fall apart at any moment. And there's a manic energy here, a sense of spiraling out of control that aligns perfectly with the album's overarching themes of despair, rebellion. And for this one, Dime pulls out the wah, and it's a level of evil that would make Sabbath completely jealous. And Suicide Note Part 1 might be the most haunting track on the album. It opens with a delicate, almost fragile acoustic riff, creating this false sense of calm. Some nice, tasty 12-string acoustic over some string pads. This one really shows Dime's versatility as a player. He was equally comfortable on the acoustic and really knew how to tease out some seriously haunting chord progressions on it. This is almost like their answer to Wish You Were Here by Floyd, but much more of the version from Hell. Phil's vocals are subdued but heavy with sadness as the lyrics pull no punches in their depiction of the ideation. And it's a moment of vulnerability that feels unsettling in the context of such a brutal album. But it's already at this point in the album obvious that the Pantera tour de force was fully underway. Suicide Note Part 2. Well, bye-bye calmness. Where Part 1 whispered, Part 2 screams. This song is an all-out thrash assault, a jarring contrast to what feels like being ripped out of a dream into a nightmare. The track's violent, both in sound and theme, capturing that internal struggle of addiction and the chaos of hitting rock bottom. You got the band moving at breakneck speed, Phil's vocals being this mix of desperation and rage, delivering one of the most intense performances of his career. Dime breaks out the whammy pedal for this one, and if anybody can make that thing sound evil, leave it to Dime. And he used it really tastefully during the bridge section. And then the industrial undertones and vibes of Living Through Me, Hell's Wrath, set it apart from the rest of the album. It's like Pantera was dabbling with sounds that were kind of almost mechanical, but adding this layer of grime to an already filthy record. Lyrically, the track is another dive into addiction, this time focusing on more of the self-destructive side and hellish experiences that came with it. But it fits perfectly with those jagged riffs. The drums are relentless, and the overall vibe of just being trapped in a nightmare of your own making. The vocals on this one are tight as hell, and the band and Phil both are just locked into this unstoppable groove, truly operating as one single unit, even though they recorded it in separate places, which is ironic in itself. And this one in particular is just screaming for the stage. And the dissonant riff underneath the chorus is so damn infectious. And then the song breaks down into one of the most surprising, hauntingly beautiful interludes. Phil's voice surrounding your head all over the place, giving out this evil, subdued vibe. It's like a horror movie, but scarier, if that's even possible. And then all-out in-your-face thrash that is just as heavy as the way Trendkill opened the album before they go right back in that solid lock groove. Just purely insane. And then we have Floods. Dimebag Darrell's shining moment on the album features this guitar solo that has become absolutely legendary. As a solo, partly improvised from riffs that he used during live shows as a masterclass in dynamics. It starts off kind of mournful, double-tracked, panned hard left, hard right, with this almost bluesy feel before building into this soaring emotional peak that just rips your heart out. It leaves you hanging on every single note coming out of his guitar, played with so much passion and pain. And just when you think he's done, he gets out of that double-tracked feel into the center pan sounds that just angrily cries right through the speakers. Coming out of that solo, he kicks in that whammy pedal again, and then it's just back to pure evil. And this one got ranked. It was like 15th on Guitar World's list of 100 greatest guitar solos. And it's not hard to see why, though it could definitely occupy even a higher spot. But it wasn't just the solo. I mean, the entire track is this brooding atmospheric piece. Some of the chord progressions in this one are so dark that they're almost bright again. That's the only way to describe it, as it has this eeriness where even the light parts are every bit as heavy as the heaviest moments on the album. And this stands as the centerpiece of an album that in and of itself is the centerpiece in the band's entire catalog. Pantera turns their sights on the metal scene itself with The Underground in America, where they offer a critique of trends and the homogenization of heavy music. There's a real bitterness in the lyrics, a sense of betrayal by the very scene they helped build. And musically, that track is a deliberate choice to reinforce this message. Grinding riffs, stomping drums, and Phil delivering his vocal lines with a pure sneer. And then Reprise, Sandblasted Skin, is one hell of a closer. It's like the band is just opening a vein and letting everything pour out. It's chaotic and abrasive, lacking the polish of their earlier work, but making up for it with sheer energy. And this song really encapsulates the overall feel of the Great Southern Trendkill. Not meant to be easy or comfortable. It's just this brutal, honest reflection of a band barely holding it together. Listen to it loud enough, and yes, it will have the effect of sandblasting skin, no doubt. So when the album dropped on May 7th, 1996, it actually hit the charts with a promising start, peaking at number 4 on the Billboard 200. But despite the strong debut, the album was actually met with this mixed reception. Critics were divided. Some praised Pantera's refusal to bow to commercial pressures and the album's unapologetic heaviness, but others were struggling with its abrasive, almost antagonistic nature. The album did not aim to please. That was not its goal. A lot of people saw this album as like a step backward commercially, lacking radio-friendly singles that could probably push sales. And of course, for casual listeners, it'd probably be a hard one to take in at first. But little did people know at that time just how legendary this album would actually become within their catalog. Because as the years go by, after everything that had happened, including losing Dime and Vinnie, when their fan base takes a look back at their collection of albums, this one is always the pure standout. And thankfully, the album did do well. I mean, within 2 months, it was certified gold. In 2004, it had reached platinum status. It was a pure cult classic, a record for those who actually got it. During a time when metal was starting to look like it was going soft, where bands were experimenting with alternative sounds and flirting with the mainstream, Pantera was like, screw that. They just doubled down on their core ethos. They didn't just resist the shift, they actively pushed against it. And this defiance really resonated deeply within the metal community, particularly with fans who felt left behind by the genre's evolution. You know, the biggest thing about this album, though, the Great Southern Trendkill showed that metal didn't need to conform in order to survive. It influenced a new generation of extreme metal bands, teaching them that unfiltered emotion and brutal honesty could carve out a space in an industry even when the mainstream had seemingly turned its back. So what happened next? Well, despite the turmoil surrounding the album's creation, most notably Phil's heroin overdose, Pantera pushed forward with the Trendkill tour. They played through Ozfest, rubbing shoulders with metal's finest, later joining Sabbath for their monumental reunion tour. The shows were intense. There was that sense that anything could happen, but the tour went on without any major incidents, but the cracks in the band were beginning to widen. The band would record one more album, Reinventing the Steel, in 2000, eventually unraveling, with Phil going off and focusing on side projects like Down, Superjoint Ritual, Dime and Vinnie going on to form Damage Plan, and of course we know the tragic story that happened after that, losing Dimebag to a senseless act by a complete psychopath. But the Great Southern Trendkill stands as this moment in time when, even though the band was on the verge of collapse, they pulled it together and came out with something that was just completely historical. I have covered Dimebag Darrell, his entire life and career in detail. I have left a link to that video. And I've also covered a few Pantera albums as well. Those links are also in the description. Make sure you check them out. I want to thank you so much to my subscribers just for being awesome. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, put on a pair of steel-toe boots and give that subscribe button a nice good smack. And while you're at it, kick the living daylights out of the like button as well. Just be kind, because apparently the price of monitors are going up. Nevertheless, join the family. I want to thank you so much for watching.